Victoria was one of 3 states to allow genetically modified crops to be planted 2 years ago. Now the first case of farm-to-farm contamination has occurred. January's floods swept GM canola from one farm near Horsham onto an adjacent property that was GM-free. Now that farmer has little alternative but to sue his neighbour. James Bennett reports.
Well, the water came out of this paddock here to our west where you can see the rise.
Bob Mackley is contemplating a situation he believes could destroy his community, the need to sue his neighbour.
I've got a neighbour and he's a hell of a nice bloke. I'd rather have a neighbour than an enemy, but the OGTR has set up a situation where the only way I can resolve this issue at the moment is through the courts. That's not going to build community.
At first glance, this paddock is like any other, but January's floods swept his neighbour's genetically modified canola seed onto his land.
This fence that you can see broken and torn here was torn down by the volume of water and canola and plant material coming off his land onto mine. I now cannot grow canola in this paddock for at least 3 years because of this seed that's here.
Depending on demand, Bob Mackley would normally expect a premium of up to $50 a tonne for his GM-free canola. 2 genetically modified varieties were given commercial approval by the federal gene technology regulator back in 2003. Despite widespread concern about the accidental spread of GM canola, the issue of who is responsible has never been decided by either the federal regulator or any state government.
Well, government said before they lifted the bans on GM canola that it would be able to be segregated. We said all the time that segregation was impossible, and the overseas experience, particularly in North America, shows that canola in particular will spread in the environment.
In 2008, the major crop-growing states, Victoria, New South Wales and Western Australia, all lifted their moratoriums on genetically modified crops.
When GM was introduced, we were told that coexistence was not a problem. It's proven not to be the case, and it's, I believe, an absolute failure of the Office of Gene Technology Regulation to allow things to get to the point where we're told that the way to resolve issues is legally.
The ABC has spoken to Bob Mackley's neighbour, Lyle Head. He didn't want to be interviewed, but was keen to play down the incident and its potential to pit neighbour against neighbour in a court battle. He says he remains on good terms with Bob Mackley and wants to keep it that way.
But in Western Australia, that situation is already unfolding. Steve Marsh was stripped of his organic certification when a neighbour's GM canola blew onto his property.
Under our organic standards, we had a zero tolerance.
He can no longer sell his wheat, oats, rye, spelt or even fat lambs as organic. He's now suing his neighbour for the lost income.
It's pretty sad, actually, neighbour against neighbour, and the effect on different families, and that's the saddest part about it, particularly in a small community where you rely on each other so much.
He's frustrated that state governments have left it up to farmers to spend their own money hiring lawyers to work out who should pay.
We shouldn't have to go to court under common law to try and deal with this issue. I personally think we need some sort of fund or levied against the biotech industry and the companies.
Steve Marsh's case is being closely watched around the world by both sides of the GM debate. Should he win, other farmers are certain to think twice about planting a product that could cost them dearly if or when it spreads. But he faces a difficult battle.
There's a lot we've got to establish in regards to the law and that sort of stuff.
Back in Victoria, the state's peak farming body says Bob Mackley's situation is similar.
Each individual grower who grows canola does their best endeavours to make sure that the product they grow stays on their farm. As I said, there are some unforeseen events that can happen, and I don't think we can plan or make rules for those.
The Victorian Farmers Federation has long argued that genetically modified crops are an important tool for farmers to cope with weeds and drought. It believes farmers should just work it out.
If they do have a problem, then jump the fence and talk to their neighbour and try and resolve their issues calmly and quietly.
The new Victorian Agriculture Minister, Peter Walsh, who fought for GM crops while in opposition, agrees.
The role of the state here is is fairly insignificant. That, as I said, GM
Should it be?
GM is controlled by the gene technology regulator. I think it would be very risky if we go into making a whole heap of regulations.
Nor is Peter Walsh swayed by anti-GM campaigners' arguments about the value of GM-free canola markets in Europe.
If you look at the history of the European market, we effectively only get access to Europe with canola when there is a shortage in Europe. It's not a market that you would develop a major industry on.
He also says because Bob Mackley isn't an organic farmer, there are chemicals he can use which will kill any remnant seed, neutralising the problem. Bob Mackley insists that's not the point, arguing his paddock is just one example of a spreading problem which governments are unable or unwilling to address.
We need to have this situation clarified, and clarified very definitively about where the responsibility lies and where the benefits should lie, and some form of recompense.
And the ABC approached Monsanto, the company that produces the GM canola seed, but they declined to be interviewed.